Alright, hey everyone, welcome back to another explained series video, and this video is special. This is about Apex triggers, and we'll be talking about Apex triggers, we'll be understanding the basics, but more importantly, this explained series will not be just one video. This will be 30 videos after today's video. Yes, that's correct. We'll be talking and we'll be doing live 30 use cases on triggers that will help you understand and make decisions on how to use triggers, where to use them, when should you use the before context, when should you use the after context, and all the major decisions you have to take with triggers. You can figure that out yourself very easily after you go through these 30 use cases. These 30 use cases are different. Every use case is different, and I have tried to cover as much as scenarios as possible, but today we'll be talking about Apex triggers, understanding them, and then from tomorrow for the next 30 days you get to see one use case each as a separate video, me coding it live in front of you and talking it through you so that you understand how my mind thinks about triggers and how do I solve a use case, how do you actually figure out how to go about solving a problem, right? So that's about this particular explained series. Today's video will just be about triggers as basics. This is going to be a long one, but let's get started. All right, so Apex triggers. First of all, let's understand what are Apex triggers for anyone who's from the admin background and has not started off development, or someone who has started off development but is not completely sure of how to go about it and where to start. Triggers can be a good point to start if you know the order of execution and you want to write any kind of logic as soon as you save a record. Triggers is the place where you do that, right? So Apex triggers, as the name suggests, act like trigger points, right, to perform custom actions before or after any changes that are made to Salesforce records. Now these changes can be insertions, updations, or deletions, right? Now if I were to take you to Salesforce and if I were to open an account record, right? So when I go to the account tab and I click on the new button, what am I trying to do? I'm trying to create a new record, right? Let's say I fill all of these values and I hit the save button. What really happens? A record gets saved into the database, right? Now, as soon as the record gets saved into the database, you might want to do things before it is saved and after it is saved, right? Similarly, let's say you have a record you have created, Burlington Textiles, and you want to modify this record, right? So when you hit on the edit button and you make some changes to the fields, you might want to do things before the record is saved or actually saved to the database and after it is saved to the database, right? One simple example would be, if as soon as I save my record, I want to send a notification to the account owner saying that the rating has changed, right? Or let's say I want to send out an email to my customer saying your annual revenue has changed, right? And if I create a new account record or a contact record, I can send an email to the admin saying a new customer has just signed up in our system, right? So where do you do these kind of activities? You do them on trigger actions, right? These are the trigger points you use, and for using these points you have to use Apex triggers, right? And primarily they work with the CRUD operations. It could be an insertion, updation, or a deletion. There's one more use case, but primarily you would use it for these three things. Okay, now you can even run a trigger when a record is restored from the recycle bin. I hope you know you can delete records, right? And when you delete records, where do they go? They go to the recycle bin, right? You have something that's called a recycle bin here. So as soon as you delete any kind of record, that goes to the recycle bin, and you can, I'm so sorry, this is my auto correct. So if you go to the recycle bin, you might have a record here, and if you see a record and you want to restore it, right, you can restore it from here. And you can have a trigger perform some actions on this event also, which means if you want to restore something or undo a deletion, even that can be tackled through triggers, right? That's the other use case apart from these three. Cool. So triggers are available on object level. So you can write a trigger for every object. So you would understand, how do I write it, for who do I write it? It is basically on an object to object basis. So if I am on the opportunities and I want to modify something based on how opportunity is saved, I would go to the opportunity object and I can create a trigger for the opportunity object. Okay. So you see the triggers option is here, and this is on the object level. So every object has a different trigger, right? You write a separate trigger for every object. Now all triggers are bulk triggers by default, which means they are capable of handling multiple records at a time. Always write triggers keeping this in mind. So what happens normally is, if I were to go to this record and modify it and I were to write a trigger on it, would I want to write it on just for this record? What if you do a data import, right? What if you do a mass update? In those cases, our trigger should be able to handle multiple records at once. So Salesforce triggers provide you the capability because they are bulkified in general, right? You get some variables that are already bulkified. So they are called bulk triggers. They don't handle one record at a time. Okay. So every time you write a record, your code should always be intelligent enough to process multiple records. Even if the use case is, let's say that's, one record at a time, you should always attempt or try to handle the trigger code in such a way so that if multiple records come into the picture, our Apex code, or rather the trigger code, is capable of handling that. All right. So that's about the triggers introduction. Now, an important point, we have been talking a lot about low code and no code automation, right? That is process builders, flow automation, flow builders, creating sites and all of it. But why would we write triggers over process builders and flows, right? Salesforce has been promoting flow builders like anything, and looks like everything needs to be shifted to flow builder so that we can achieve as much as automation we can. But why do we need triggers, and when should you go about using triggers and not processes and flows, right? Now there are some use cases where you would need triggers. If you are familiar with flows and process builder, you'll get this easily, or else it's okay, you can just be with me and I'll help you understand. So with triggers, you can handle before events, not just after events. Okay, so with process builders, you cannot do that, right? Process builders, you can do as soon as a record is created or a record is created or edited, right? That means once the action is completed, that is when you can hit the process builder. But what if you wanted to do something before it happens, right? We'll talk about the order of execution very soon, but before events can be handled in triggers. They can be handled in flows as well, but process builder does not let you do that, right? So if you want to handle before events, you can go with triggers or flows. Next thing is handling exceptions and showing user relevant errors instead of generic errors, right? Now with process builder and flows, we get an unhandled fault exception, maybe some issue with the flow, maybe the fault path is shown, or the process builder failed. So we get a very weird error, a very long error that shows the entire trace, and the message is very much non-user friendly and non-user readable. So if you want to handle exceptions well, you can use triggers, right? And you can handle them by showing them generic instead of generic errors, you can show them messages that are relevant to understanding what the issue was. So you can use the add error method and you can show exceptions and you can handle them, right? You can even create custom exceptions and you can show them to the user through triggers. All right. Next is handle delete and undelete events. So you can handle deletion and undeletion events, as in, let's say you want to restore some information from the recycle bin and you want your admin to know that 5 records were restored. Can you do that from process builder? No, you cannot. So you can do this from triggers, right? Handle complex custom logic that cannot be easily maintained and managed by automation. Now you might have a use case wherein you have 15 countries, 84 price rates, 34 price books, or a good catalog of products, and you want to handle some level of custom logic that has to work with different profiles in a different way. Understand creating decision nodes on the flows, creating those nodes on the process builder, the if ladders. It will be very complicated, it will be very cumbersome, and it will be difficult to maintain in future, right? The versioning and the maintenance will be a pain, right? So it's better to move any kind of very complex custom logic into triggers, and this is where you can handle it a bit better and you can maintain it. All right. Additional validation checks that you want to put to avoid bad data, you can put it here. Like we said, we can handle before events, right? So before the record is saved, we can check if the data is correct, if the data does not contain any discrepancy, any issues. So we can show an error. We can do some validation checks before the data is committed into the database. That can also be done from triggers, right? Now partial success is allowed in triggers but not in processes, which is more of an all or none framework, right? If your process builder fails, your entire transaction is rolled back. You don't get to save a specific record, or if you have 10 records you want to save, one of them failed, your processes don't let you save the other 9 records. But you can attempt this on triggers. You can have partial updates or partial success can be achieved and can be set up in triggers. That's also something why you'd want to use triggers over process and flows. All right. So now let's begin and let's talk about the trigger basics. We'll try to understand the framework. Okay. So there are 2 primary, or rather 2 general trigger types. One are the before triggers and the other one are the after triggers. So before triggers are primarily used to update additional values to the record or validate them before they are saved in the database. Whereas after triggers are used to update the related or unrelated records and do any kind of post processing after the record is saved to the database. right? So the difference here is that before the record is saved on the database, if you want to do any operations, you do it on the before triggers. And if you want to do any kind of processing or any kind of related stuff in the trigger, after the record is saved, you do it here, right? These are the two primary types of triggers, not types, but rather the two broad division wherein you have before triggers and after triggers. All right. Let's quickly talk about the syntax. So the syntax has trigger as the keyword. You put a trigger name and then you write on. So you say trigger on account object. So you have the API name of the object here. And then you mention all the trigger events. And under this particular block, you add all your code, right? Now trigger events are comma separated events that need to be invoked through the trigger. All right. Let's quickly go to Salesforce and let's create a trigger here. So I'm on the developer console. So in order to create a trigger, we go to file and we click on the new button. And you have all the options available here. You can create lightning components, Visualforce components or pages, Apex class, and then you have Apex triggers, right? So when I hit on the Apex trigger, you get an option to give it a name and select an object. Like I said, triggers are on object level. So you have to give it a name. Let's say contact trigger. And then I can choose the contact object here. This one right here, and I say submit, right? As soon as I do that, you see the same syntax pops up automatically. It says trigger, name of the trigger, on keyword, and name of the object, followed by the trigger events. Now if you see, by default Salesforce gave us one event, that is before insert, right? But this is nothing but a set of comma separated events. I can say after insert also, after delete, before update. I can put all of those events. We'll talk about these events very soon, but this is your comma separated list of trigger events that you can use, right? And this is where your trigger code goes, right? All your trigger code will be here. Okay. Now this would be on the contact record. Let's go back to our screen and let's see what's here. So note that database changes are automatically rolled back if trigger does not run successfully. So any kind of database changes that are done, they will be automatically rolled back if the trigger does not run successfully, right? You might have set the partial thing to true. In that case, partial rollback will happen and some records might be saved. But by default, if you do not use that concept, the database changes are automatically rolled back. Okay. So let's say you are doing a transaction and you hit the save button, but the trigger fails somehow. The record will not be saved into the system and you have to create the record again. That is what it means, right? That is what rollbacking is. Okay. Cool. Now let's talk about these trigger events that we were trying to figure out here, right? This section right here, that is the trigger events. If I take a look at all the events, you see that you have something that's called before insert, before update, before delete. These are your before triggers, right? We talked about the two broad categories, right? Before triggers and after triggers. So you have before insert, before update, and before delete. Similarly, for insert, update, and delete, you have after insert, after update, and after delete. What does this mean? This means before a record is inserted into the system, do things here. Before the record is updated, make changes here. Before the record is deleted, stop them from doing that. After the record is inserted, send an email. After an update is done to the system, update the child records also. After the record is deleted, notify the owner of the record. And then you have one more use case, which was our recycle bin concept. This is your after undelete. Undelete is nothing but restoring deleted data, right? So you have something that's called after undelete, and this is not available for all objects. It is only available for some objects. We can refer the documentation for that. Okay, these are all your events that we will use, and this pretty much cover all kind of operations that you have. You are covering insert operations, update operations, delete operations, and undelete operations, and both before and after. Now you might think, why do you not see a before undelete? Because before undelete is not something that can be predicted. Can you say when would a record be restored? You don't have a time frame for that, right? After you restore a record is when you can say, okay, I undeleted it, right? But you cannot say that before. Before undelete does not exist because it is not something that can be predicted by the system, right? No one can predict when you would undelete it, right? Those were all our events, and if I were to write them here, if I show you here, you can just say before insert, before update, before delete, after insert, after update, after delete, and then after undelete. And when I hit the save button, this should save successfully because all the events are accepted, right? Now, if I write something like before undelete, let's see what happens, and say save. So you see I get a problem here and it says trigger usage before undelete is not supported. So this is something that is not supported by triggers. So we can get rid of this and we can say save again. So this becomes your comma separated list of trigger events. Alright, I hope you understand what the event is here. Before insert, that's the event. The insert is the event, and when is the context? It is the before context. Similarly, you have after update. When is the context? You have after the record is updated. Alright. Next, let's take a look at what kind of context variables we have when we are using triggers. Right now, like I told you, triggers are already bulkified in nature, right? They are bulk triggers. They don't work on one record, they work on multiple records together. So how do you figure out in this particular code snippet here, right? How do you figure out which event, what do you want to do on what event? You have all your events available here, but you want to do X when before insert happens, let's say, right? You want to do Y when before update happens. You want to do Z when after undelete happens. How do you distinguish all of that inside your code here, right? So for you to be able to understand whether the context is before insert or before update, you have some context variables available that help you decide what is the current context that you are in, right? When I say current context, how would this work? If I go to the contacts list here, I click on the new button and I create a record, let's say, okay? I say Himanshu Maheshwari, and let's say I click on the save button. What am I trying to do here? I'm trying to create or rather insert a record, correct? So as soon as I hit the save button, Salesforce will internally check, do I have an event for insert? It will see, okay, I have before insert and I have after insert. So I have to take care of these two actions now. But let's say you have to do J when after insert happens. Now you have two things, before insert and after insert, right? How do you figure out which event and how do you segregate that thing? So for that you have something that's called context variables. Context variables come from the system.trigger class, right? So you will have to use trigger dot with them. So you have something that's called isInsert. What does that let you identify? This tells you if trigger dot is insert to insert activities here. Okay, so this is more like a boolean flag from the system.trigger class. This is the system.trigger class that we have already, and we can use this context variable to help us understand, okay, is this an insert activity? It will be true if it is an insert activity. Likewise, else if it's an update event, you would assume that you have an update, isUpdate boolean, right? Yes, we do. So we'll go to the context variable and see that we have an isUpdate variable. All right. Similarly, we have isDelete that lets you identify, okay, this might be a delete operation. Then I'll say do update activities here, and I'll say else if trigger dot is delete, do delete operations here, right? This is how you are bifurcating all the context. But as of now, what you have done, you have bifurcated the CRUD operations, insert, update, and delete. How do you bifurcate the before and after activity also? You have a context variable for that. So you have something that's called is before, is after, is undelete, right? Okay, is undelete is a CRUD operation. So these four are your CRUD operations, and then you have is before and is after. So let's say in our use case, in our current use case, we are only working for an insert scenario, let's say, right? I get rid of the update and delete scenario, I get rid of all of these extra events, right? Let's say this is our only use case. These are the two events that we need to work on. I'll save it here, right? So I have to do my insert activities here, and in here I can simply say if trigger dot is before. Another context variable I'm using, I'll say do before activities here, right? And else I can say do after activities here. Make sense? So the else will run if it is not a before context, if it is an after context. Do you want to test it? Let's test it. So I'll put a debug log everywhere so that we can see how things look like. So I'll say inside insert scenario. Okay. And then I'll put a debug log in the before and the after context. Inside before scenario. And then I'll put a debug log here saying inside after scenario. All right, now let's see, as soon as we create a contact record, what really happens. Okay, I'll get rid of these extra comments. Okay, so this is my current trigger and I have only two use cases. One is for before and one is for after, and that's only for the insert. Right, let's go and let's enable my debug log and let's open the debug log window. And here let's see if we get a new log when I create a contact record. Okay, so I'm just putting in the mandatory field values and I'll hit on the save button. So now this says contact is created. Let's go back to the debug log and I see a new log created, this one right here, right? This is 5.9 KB, probably this is the one. So you see, contact trigger on contact trigger, event is before insert, right? Now if I hit the debug only tab, I see inside the insert scenario, inside before scenario, inside insert scenario, and inside after scenario. Do you see what happened? First, it executed the before context. That is why it came in here. It found that, you know, we have insert events available. So what would it execute first? It would go inside here. It would evaluate to true. Is insert is evaluated to true. It gave me this debug log, right? And then it checked whether it is a before context or an after context. It was before. So the before one runs first. So it executed this one. After the before triggers ran, it went ahead and wanted to run the after insert. So it came back here again and it's checked whether the whether the context variable is insert. Yes, it is insert, but this time it went back and went to the else condition because it was the after context this time. So you see, inside insert scenario, then before, and then this log comes again and then after, right? So the code traversed this particular block 2 times and this one once and this one once, which kind of tells you the trigger runs the before context first and the after context later, right? That is what is here, right? You see 4, then 6, then 4, and then 9. So it's 4, this is 4, 6, then 4 and 9. All right. What if I have this code, but I do not have the event declared here? What happens then? Let's refresh. The code will save up fine, right? But now only before insert is defined. Now Salesforce will see what happens. Let's click on this clone button and let's create another record. And if I create Himanshu 1 and say save and take a look at the developer console, this time I opened up the wrong console log. Let's open the 4.1 KB one, right? Now if I go to the debug logs, let's see. So you see, I see only inside insert and inside before scenario. Why? Even though you had the else condition there, but you did not declare your event. If you did not declare your event, Salesforce does not go inside and work on that event. You have to have it here for your code to be executed for that event. This is mandatory. Okay. So if you have after insert, only then this code will be executed, or else it will be completely ignored, because you are trying to tell them, I want to only work on this event. No other events I need to focus on. So it does not even care what else you have written in the else condition. It will just check, okay, insert before. It will just do this. It will come back here, but it will not execute it again because after insert is not mentioned. Make sense? So this is how your context trigger works. Context variables work. What are the variables we looked at? We looked at before and after variable and insert, update, and delete. Now there are 2 more, or rather 3 more. Yes, new, old, and size. So like I said, trigger is already bulkified. So if you're working with one record, you can check trigger.size. It will show you 1. But if multiple records come in like through an import or a mass update or a mass delete, then trigger.size will vary. Okay, let's check what is the trigger.size here. Let's get rid of all of this. So if I put trigger.size here, I can use something like this, let's save it, right? Trigger.size is saved, and I'll just put a space here, and before insert is there. Let's see how many records come into the transaction when I create one record. It should give me the size of the trigger, or rather the context. How many records are showing up? So I'll just say Himanshu 2 and say save. So I created one record. Let's go and see what is showing on the log. Let's open this log right here, and this should show me inside insert scenario 1. So I have 1 record here, right? And if it was a bulk scenario wherein you did some data import or something, the trigger.size would vary based on whatever the number of records that come into the picture. Okay, but if you have to check, you can use the trigger.size for checking things, like, you know, to avoid any kind of governor limit issues. You can do that, but this is one variable you can use. Okay, you can segregate your code like this. If trigger.size is equal to 1, right, you can say do this operation. You might want to do things differently. do this operation. And if it is more than 1, then you want to do it differently. Correct? So that's where you can use the trigger.size. Okay. Now, every time you're on the trigger, you have two variables, trigger.new and trigger.old. These are another two variables that you get, right? Developer console does not let you align things by default, so I'll just say old, save. Okay, I think there's an extra bracket. Let's get rid of it and say save again. So right, this is saved now. Let's give it a relevant tag name, new record, and let's give it old record here. Okay, I'll show you something. Save. So these are two more variables that you get from triggers. Okay, let's see what happens now when we create a record. If I click on the clone button and if I now save the contact record and say save, this got saved successfully. And if I go back here and I take a look at the logs, and if I say debug only, you see under the new record, I get the entire record that's created. All the field values are there and it holds the value that I have put in the record, right? See, Himanshu 3, Maheshwari, everything else is null because I did not put anything else. Salutation is Mr. Right? This is your new record, which is nothing but the trigger.new. This variable holds whatever you are inserting right now, the new information that you are inserting. But now let me ask you something. Trigger.old is something that will hold the old information, right? When does this come in the picture? Let's say I don't want to have the insert context. I want to have the update context, right? And if this is update, I would say show me trigger.new and show me trigger.old values. Okay. Now if I go back and I edit this record, because I want to do an update scenario, right? Let's edit this record and let's put a title. Let's put architect, right? And I'll say save. So I'm updating the record. Do I have an update context? Yes, before update is there, and this will run true because I just updated. So it should give me the debug logs, right? Let's go back and let's open the debug logs. So I have 6.79 KB debug log, and let's say what's only the debug only. Now take a look at these two records, right? You see, this is the new record and this is the old record. What is the old record? Let's take a look. Let's take a look. I don't see the title information coming up because that's longer than the text that it is supposed to show. So what I can do is, let me modify something that's here on the top. Let's modify the salutation. Okay, let's go back. Let's close this log first of all. Let's go back and now let's go to details and I'll just change the salutation and I'll change it to doctor. All right, I'll say save. Now let's take a look at the debug log. I made an update, right? I should have a debug log. Yes, I do. 6.2 KB. Let's open this debug log and now let's see. The salutation on the new record is doctor and the salutation on the old record is Mr. Which means you get to work on two different versions of your record, the old version and the new version. And this is what these two variables are for. Okay, the trigger.new will hold all the information that you are currently committing to the database, which is new, the changes that you have made. Whereas the trigger.old will hold information that was there before you made the change. So in case you want to make some kind of if conditions, you want to understand whether a specific value has changed or not, all of those kind of operations can be done. We'll look at how to use these two variables, and there are two more variables which are maps of the similar concept, but we'll understand how to use them. Okay, but for now just understand new holds the new information that you just committed to the database, old holds the information that was just prior to what you when you made the changes. Okay, now an interesting thing to note, when I use the isInsert scenario and I was just using this event here, right? We saw this log and it had new information but old information was not there. It showed us null. Null is nothing but empty, basically no information. Why was the old record null? Because trigger.old cannot hold any value if you are inserting a record. Understand this, when you are creating the record for the very first time, will you have an older version of it? No, you will not, right? Which is why trigger.old shows null when you are using the insert scenario. And you can have values on the trigger.old in the update scenario or the delete scenario. right? So we'll see how where you have these records and where you can use these variables. The variables are available for different context or different events, and they are available for specific reasons. We'll take a look at that map also. For now, just understand that trigger.new holds the newer information that you commit, and the old variable holds the older information. Okay. So those were the context variables. I think there are two more variables I did not mention here, which is trigger.new map, and this is trigger.old map. So you have new map and old map also. So these are nothing but the trigger.new and the trigger.old holds a record of type object, right? But if you want to store a map, you can use the same using a map. Let's see what's the difference. Now I have before insert and I have is insert check here. Let's see what does the new map show us. If I go ahead and say clone and I say Himanshu 4 and say save, I just created a new record. So I should see a trigger.new map value, but that would be a map, that would be of type collection map. Okay. And it comes in handy when we are doing comparisons. We'll take a look at that also very soon when we do our use cases. For now, just understand that we have these. So the trigger.new record shows null as well, which is weird. Let's put after insert also, and let's see if I can get you the information from the new map. Let's close this and let's go back. Let's clone it one more time and show 5. Let's say save. Okay, let's go to developer console. Let's see if I have a new log 7.23. I believe we have information. I don't see. Yeah. So you see the new map and the old map is not available in the before context, right? So the new map and the old maps are not available on the before context, but under the after context, you see that something new has been added and that is being shown on the after context. You understand why you see the same logs twice? Because it is running the before context first. It came in here, is insert, it ran the before context, then it came back and saw, okay, after insert is also there, I have to execute it one more time for the after scenario. And that's when it found out that new map has a value. It does not hold anything in the before insert. And if you see, the new map is nothing but a key value grid, wherein the key is the object ID, the record ID of the object, and the value is the entire object itself. Okay, so if you see this 003 ending with 880 is nothing but this particular record ID of the record, this particular record ID 003 A80, right? And you get this entire record as a value of this particular key, and you get it on the after insert record. So you see the variables differ and play different game when you change the context, and we'll understand this entire grid of where which variable fits into the picture, where would a variable be used and why would it not be in a specific scenario. We'll understand all of it in our later part of the video. Okay, we'll make a grid of where to use which variable. Cool. So that was about context variables and pretty much everything you would want to use and play with when you are writing triggers. This would be your entire game. Let's understand some considerations we have. So you cannot use DML, or rather the database operations, on trigger.new and trigger.old. You might be wondering, okay, trigger.new holds the contact information. What if I make an update to that variable itself? No, you cannot do that. Okay, trigger.old is always read only, and we can't make any changes on top of it because trigger.old holds the older value, right? And you just have it to understand context. You cannot play with it and you cannot modify it. Even if you modify it, where would you save it? Because now you are saving the newer version, the trigger.new information, right? So trigger.old is available for you to understand things and check things, but it is always in the read-only format, which means you cannot make any updates to the trigger.old variable or the record that it holds. Okay, now we can use trigger.new in before context to update values, but not in the after context. Trigger.new holds a value. In our case, it held the contact information. Now let's say let's say I put one more check here. I say if trigger dot is before, right? And here I want to update contact record, shipping address. I can do that here without writing any extra database operations. But if I want to do the same thing is in the after context, trigger will fail. It will not let me do it because the trigger.new becomes read only in the after context. It does not let you do any update operations here. Okay, because the difference between the before and the after is right at this point, the database commit happens. The record is not completely saved and the transaction is not completed, but the commit is saved, that the record is saved into the system. And it is a copy or an instance is created. So you cannot re-update it here. Okay, you can do things here like without writing any database operations. You can do things like, you know, contact dot address equals. You can make some changes here. What will happen is, because the record is getting committed somewhere here, you are being allowed to make changes here and add some values or remove some values or do those kind of things. But as soon as you do your commit, which happens somewhere here, we'll understand the order of execution, which happens here in the after context. You cannot again update the record. One more understanding of why this is not allowed is, let's say Salesforce let us do this, right? Salesforce let us update contact here. Okay, now if the contact is updated here, it will again go back to the trigger, and if I have an after update scenario, right, it will run the after update scenario and it will come back and it will keep on going into a loop. There is a chance that this might run into recursion or it might run into a loop, right? So it is better Salesforce prevents this and does not let us do anything in the after context. It makes the record read only. You can only use the record to mess with or play around with other records. So you have the contact information, but you can fetch the child cases and you can make changes to the child cases. That is something you can do. But the same record that is in the current transaction, the contact record, this record cannot be modified. You want to do that kind of modification, do it here on the before context. That's why the before context exists. Do not do it on the after context. That is a bad practice. That's not a good practice, and that might lead to recursion, and that is something that Salesforce will not allow. All right, cool. Let's get rid of all of this code that makes no sense, right? All right, I hope you're following me. If not, slow down the video, or else go back a few slides, start again from here. But yeah, this should help and help you understand. But we'll understand it a bit better when we do actual use cases. Okay, every use case I'll explain you why am I doing things, why did I choose this variable, why is this value showing this kind of record. Everything we'll discuss, okay, with practical examples. Cool. Now comes order of execution. So order of execution is basically Salesforce's way of governing how a record will be processed into the database. There are n number of things that happen behind the scenes. We'll look at what all happens and in what order. Because if you do not have a governing order, how do you understand what will run first, what will go next? There are different tools, right? You have process builders. You don't have workflows now, but you have process builders, flow builders. You have the before triggered flows. You have integration jobs. You have post-processing email templates. You have approval process. You have a lot of things. Case entitlement, lead processes, sales processes, duplicate rules, matching rules. Lot of things, right? You have triggers. Which goes first, what goes next? There has to be an execution order, and this is basically the order of execution. We'll now understand the before and after context, and it will be very clear to you understanding how Salesforce really goes with the order of execution. Now, as soon as you hit the save button, what really happens behind the scenes is basically what's told here. And here I've taken an example of when you are making an update to the system. Right now, when you're making an update to the system, you have a record in the system already, which was inserted some time back. Right now, when you have the record in the system, that original record is loaded from the database, and whatever are the old values, they are overwritten with the new values that you made changes to. Okay, that overwrite is done. Now, if the request is coming from a standard UI page, what is a standard UI page? A normal page layout where we create the records, right? This page layout. If I click on the edit button, this is the standard UI page, right? And if I click on the new button on the tab, that is the standard UI page. If a request comes from this particular screen, these kind of screens, what happens? It checks for the layout specific rules. We can configure page layouts, right? We can set fields required, read only, we can do record page checks, we can do all of these things, right? And then any kind of metadata information, like, the field format is correct or not, what is the maximum length that we've put on the object field level, any field definition discrepancy has happened or not. All those checks are done, and if there's an issue, Salesforce shows it on the page itself. But if the request is from a custom source being a custom component, a custom controller, a custom flow screen, it only checks for the foreign keys, because these rules don't matter here, right? They will only matter if you are going from the standard layout page. So here it only checks for the integrity, or rather the relationship. If the relationship is at fault, it throws an error, or else it lets you go ahead. Now, if multi-line items are created, only then custom validation rules are run. What are multi-line items? This could be for the quote line items. This could be for the opportunity line items, right? Those product line items. If they are created, only in that case, the custom validation rules that we have written are run here, or else they are not run here. We can just ignore this for now. Okay, because this is just for multi-line items. Now, as soon as the record is has entered into the system without any issues, the before record triggered flows execute. Now this is something relatively new in Salesforce, but you have record triggered flows, and you have both before and after record triggered flows, which means you can trigger a flow in before context and after context. Process builders do not let you do that, but flows let you do that. So this is the very first thing that executes, your before record triggered flows. And then you have something that's your before triggers. So all your before triggers run here. This is what we are working on. Okay, and this is where we got those two debug logs, right? Before insert and before insert, the insert log and the before insert log, because this ran first in terms of the order of execution. Okay, once your before triggers are run, the system and the custom validation rules run. Any kind of system rule is there, or any kind of custom validation rule that we have written, they run here. And if there's any issue, it is shown on the screen. If no issues, keep going. Now you have duplicate rules, and if there is a issue with the duplicate rule, then the data entry is blocked, and it says that a duplicate exists, or else it goes and lets you proceed. Now once your before record triggered flows are run, before triggers are run, all the before triggers, right, which means every before trigger will run, not just one objects, every objects, based on whichever record is getting inserted. Obviously, let's say you are inserting opportunity record, then all the before triggers for the opportunity record will run. Okay, then the duplicate rules, and if everything is good until here, that's when the record is saved to the database. It is not committed yet. My language was incorrect. It is saved to the record is saved, but the transaction has not been committed yet. Right? Commit is the final hammer on the stone, right? That's not done here, but it is just saved to the database. And once it is saved, this is the point till which you can make any changes to the record that you're wanting to save. But after this, your new context becomes read only, because this is where you run your all after triggers. And this happens after it is saved to the database, right? Not committed yet, obviously, but saved to the database. So Salesforce does not let you make any changes to the context again, because this is where your after triggers run. The before triggers are here, and then you have the after triggers here, which is why we saw 4 debug logs. Inside insert scenario, inside before insert, inside insert scenario, inside after insert. 2 logs from this guy, 2 logs from this guy. Once all the after triggers are run, that's when you have all the assignment and the auto response rules that run, if there are any. And then you have workflow rules. Now we don't have to worry about this section at all, because this is retired or almost retiring. You have escalation rules, and then you have all the processes and flows. There is no guaranteed execution of order of execution with the process builders. You have written multiple builders that you have, so there is no guaranteed order here. And then you have your after record save, record triggered flows. You remember what we did before? It was the before record triggered flows, and this is where your after record triggered flows run, the after record save ones. Then you have entitlement rules, and if there is any kind of roll up summary or a cross object reference, you have to update the parent record also, right? So that is done here. After all the current records information is done, the parent record is updated here. And if, let's say, your parent's parent also has some sort of roll up and some sort of cross object summary, then your grandparent record is also updated. Okay, what happens next? You have the criteria based sharing. The sharing rules execute right towards the end, and once the sharing is sorted, you commit the record to the database. This is where the final commit happens, and this kind of tells you that the transaction is completed. So anything that has been postponed, like sending email, any kind of asynchronous jobs, any kind of future methods that have been written, they are done here as a separate transaction. Okay, so this is your entire order of execution, and the important things here are on green. Execute all before triggers is where you save, write all your before triggers before the record is saved, and after the record is saved but not committed yet, you do the after triggers, right? And this sequence is important. You for an interview question, it is important that you know that the record triggered flow runs first, the before triggers run then, the after triggers run after that, and then the after record triggers run here. And in between you have the process and flow builder flows. Okay. So now you understand the before context and the after context. All these jargons and the keywords I'm talking about is because this order of execution is maintained by Salesforce and you cannot play around with or change it. Okay. Now it's important to understand how do you decide what to write on which event. You have before event, you have after event. Now where do you write what kind of things, right? For example, I told you cannot make changes to the same record in the after context. So if you have to add any information, add any field values to the record, where would you write it? It is understood. You would write it in the before trigger, right? So use before triggers when you want to set some additional values to the record that's getting saved, or if you want to validate or avoid bad data in the system and throw some errors to the end user. So when can you show the error to the user and not let the record saved into the system? In the before context, because when you're in the before context, the record is not saved to the database yet. So you can tell the user, your record does not match our criteria. We are not going to save it. Please fix it or create another record. Where do you do it? You do it on the before context, right? Similarly, if you have to set some values on your current record, you do it on the before, because Salesforce does not let you do it on the after context. Right? So now what do you do on the after context? In the after context, you want to do any kind of DML operations on related or unrelated records. Now, for example, as soon as an opportunity is updated and the stage is closed won, you want to notify all your users that hooray, we have won our opportunity. This is the revenue that we generated. And you also want to create a task for the opportunity owner and tell him to congratulate everyone in the building. Right? So these two things you would do. When would you do them? You would do them on the after trigger. You would create a task record here as a related record, and you would also send an email. So you can do any kind of post-processing logic like firing platform events, sending out emails, invoking flows, calling third-party systems. Why are you doing them after? Because you are kind of sure that the record is saved to the database, everything in the before context ran properly, and the record is going to be into the system. So everything that I have to work on after the record is saved, I'll do on the after trigger concept. Okay, one example being the opportunity being one. Right? So this is how you would decide before or after, but don't worry, we'll be doing the use cases and every question will understand why are we going for the before context or after context. Okay. The next thing is the trigger grid, the cheat sheet that you need. So this is what I was talking about, wherein we'll figure out what kind of variables are available where. So you have all of these events, right? Before insert, before update, delete, after insert, after update, after delete, after undelete, right? Let's try to figure out if we are allowed to use the grid values or not, right? If we will not be allowed to use them, Salesforce will throw an error. For example, before context, right? We saw that the trigger.old gives us null, right? But that was on the insert context. Let's do something. Let's go to Salesforce. Let's go to the developer console and let's start with before insert. So I'll say if it is trigger.is insert, and instead of writing an if condition inside, I can do it on the same line. How? I can say if trigger.is insert and trigger.is before. So this would be my before context. Okay. And if I say system.debug trigger.new and I say save, this should let me save it, right? What if I say trigger.old and I say save? So this saves as well, but the value will be null here, right? So I won't get any value. So what we have to do is we have to try doing this, and we can populate this particular grid that I have already populated, but I want you to go to developer console and do this for every event and see what the debug log shows. Okay, and that's how you can prepare this grid, and you can understand, okay, after insert I have both. I have the trigger.new, but I don't have the trigger.old. After update I have both, right? Before update I have both, right? And it's so if you notice, the trigger.old is available in both the before both the update scenarios, this one and this one. The trigger.old is available, right? Where do you not see the trigger.new? You don't see it on the delete scenarios. The trigger.new is not there in the delete scenarios, right? So you can figure that out once you try it out by putting a debug log and you create a record. You can just practice this one with one record. Okay, and if you see a value null, you can just say that you won't have the value for that particular event. Okay, you can use this grid, or you can try it on your own and you can just prepare your own grid. Trying it on your own will help you understand, okay, I am not seeing this variable. Yeah, that makes sense, because why would it be available here in this context? Does not make sense, right? So that way it would be helpful. So this is your event versus context grid. It might be that some of the values are wrong here, so I'll encourage you to take a look and try it out yourself. All right, cool. What's the next thing? The next thing is a very important consideration, best practice. You can call it whatever you want. So one trigger per object. Why is that? If you notice, the order of execution said all the before triggers and all the after triggers. Now, for example, for the contact object, you write 5 triggers, and every trigger has the before insert context. Let's say you make 5 files similar to this, 5 different files. Now, how do you expect Salesforce to understand which file to run first and which to run later? There's no way, right? And then Salesforce also does not give you a guaranteed order of execution. It will run file 1 first, file 5 second, file 3 third, and so on. The next time that you run the transaction, it might change the order because it's not giving it a number based on what you have written. It does not understand if you write trigger contact trigger 1, contact trigger 2. It does not understand all of that. So the order of execution cannot be guaranteed if for the same event and the same object you have multiple files. So it's better to avoid something like that. Why to create discrepancy if that might go wrong, right? So it is ideal that you have one trigger per object. Okay, and this is because if you have more than one triggers per object, Salesforce does not guarantee the order of execution, and in this case there is no control over which one can execute first. So in order to avoid this discrepancy in code, always write one trigger per object and host your events in that trigger code. What's the problem of writing all the events here? You can simply do things like this: trigger dot is insert and trigger dot is after, right? Similarly, I can have same blocks for all my other events. So I can just say this would be update, right? This would be update, and then I have delete, right? So is there a problem of in terms of maintenance? No. Is there an issue with having all the events on one file? No. And it is easy to maintain? Yes. So why not do it? Why create discrepancies without any reasons, right? And it is important that I mention all the events here. Only then it will run those blocks, or else it will not, right? We saw that a while ago. So I would have all the events here. Is there a problem? Are we consuming extra resources just by declaring events? No, we are not doing that. So we can go ahead and keep all of them here. And whatever you need, you can just execute that block. You can just create the blocks and you can execute. Save. Right? The file saved, and everything that you have to tackle, you can tackle in individual sections. Cool? Which is why you want one trigger per object, right? So that was all about the trigger basics, and now we'll jump into 30 scenarios, use cases, or rather live trigger examples, 30 of them, each one is different. I have all of these use cases here, and we will work on all of these use cases one by one, a video every day, right? And that will help you understand triggers. And I would encourage you to sit with me and try to write the same code by looking at the screen, trying to figure out, okay, did I make a mistake? Did I declare the variable wrong? Is my context incorrect? Is my event incorrect? Did I miss something out? And try to test it and understand, okay, this is how the trigger is working. This is how the execution is happening. This is why I use this variable, and this is why I use this context. All right. And finally, we'll actually be solving 30 use cases. All right. Do prepare this grid yourself, and that will help you understanding trigger context. And I'll see you in the next video with the very first use case. That would be use case 1 from trigger, and that would be posted on December 2, right? So until the year comes to the end, we are doing trigger coding. All right. That's all from this video of triggers explained series. I'll see you in the next one. Till then, bye.